Story 1. My parents took me to the zoo and bought a souvenir photo of a baby orangutan. They hung it on my bedroom wall and told me it was my baby picture. I absolutely believed it until I was 4 or 5. Story 2. When someone said they were trying to make ends meet, I thought they were talking about actual meat, like there was a type of food called ends meat. Story 3. Ice melting in a drink made the drink colder. So if I put a bunch of ice in a drink and then microwaved it until the ice had all melted, it would make the drink super cold a lot quicker. Story 4. I used to think that girls would get pregnant from kissing. I thought that, when swallowed, men's saliva mixed with women's saliva would make babies. Needless to say, I don't believe that anymore. Story 5. As a child, I really believed that if I stepped on a crack, I would break my mom's back. It seemed so serious at the time, and I would avoid cracks on the sidewalk like my life depended on it. Story 6. I thought my dad could control the stoplights because he would always tell me when they were about to change. I also thought that the no passing signs on the highway meant you weren't supposed to drive past that point. I thought my dad was some sort of criminal because he would just drive right past the signs. My justification for why the road continued was emergency vehicles. Story 7. I thought that inside a mother was a waiting room that had 2 long benches opposite one another. Babies sat waiting, lined up on both benches. I don't know, maybe 20 potential kids. Anyway, sometimes without warning, a door would open for a short time, and the babies would all try to exit before it closed again. If one made it out, the mother had a baby. If 2 made it out, she'd have twins. Yeah, I know. I think I was maybe 6 years old. Cut me some slack. Story 8. That spaghetti grew on trees. I saw a television commercial where they were picking it and laying it out to dry, so I believed it for years until I asked my mother if we could get a spaghetti tree so we could have fresh spaghetti. Story 9. Wow. I recently learned that I have obsessive-compulsive disorder. I was diagnosed about a year ago at age 34 and have had really successful treatment since then. But looking through all these comments and not seeing anything along the lines of, if I don't tap my finger each time we drive past a telephone pole, we're going to get into a terrible car accident. Or my dad might be able to read my mind, so I have to make sure I only think really nice things all the time. Tells me that maybe there were signs a bit earlier than I'd thought. Story 10. I thought my urine was stored in my scrotum, and I thought if I didn't pee, it would explode. I heard that from a friend and believed him. I was 6 years old. Story 11. My beloved husband once looked up at the sky and saw the clouds were moving fast, then looked me dead in the eyes and said, "The earth is spinning fast today." He was 25 at the time. Story 12. As a kid growing up in a very religious home, my parents and pastors would always talk about how in heaven we were going to spend eternity, just praising and worshiping Jesus. I hated praise and worship when I was a kid, so I used to think heaven was going to be boring, and hell sounded like a lot more fun. I'm now old enough to realize all of it is nonsense, and that made me feel so much better. Story 13. That I could hear storms in advance. I mean, it's the sound of airplanes being bounced around a low cloud ceiling and making the echo sound. So I kind of did. Story 14. That we lived on the inside of the earth in some way, since it was obvious that the sky was dome-shaped and the earth was round. But years later, I learned it was true. We are inside the atmosphere. So maybe not that ridiculous. Story 15. Close to 60 years later, I can't remember the context, but I was surprised when my second-grade teacher said, "Teachers don't know everything." I don't believe I'd ever seriously thought about it up to that point, but apparently, I had simply assumed that they did know everything and that's why they were teachers. Story 16. The 2 things I always say are, 1. Before I had ever been in a car, my favorite show as a kid was Knight Rider, specifically because of the talking car. I thought all cars had that capability. I was very disappointed on my first car ride. 2. Also, when I was a kid, before I had ever been inside a fast food restaurant, we always did drive-through, I had seen the commercials. I assumed all the mascots you saw in the commercials actually worked in the restaurants. So I was disappointed when I didn't see Ronald in McDonald's or the King in Burger King. Story 17. If I ever took anything for granted, mainly toys, my dad would always threaten to give the toys to Elmer Finkelstein. Elmer lived with his grandma and didn't get any toys ever. If I didn't like it, then Elmer would be more than happy to have it. The effectiveness of that still sticks with me over 30 years later, and we have good jokes about it. It taught me a great deal about staying humble as a core value. Story 18. I thought TV dinners, Mylar balloons, and maraschino cherries were the epitome of luxury. My dad liked to leave price tags on gifts and draw extra zeros on them as a gag. Once he bought me a book, Blitz the Big Book of Cartooning, that I very rarely opened and never used because I was terrified of ruining something worth several $1,000s. Story 19. There was some moment when adults at some point in their life were shown how to be adults, how to talk politely, pay bills, and make good decisions that worked out for them. Like an angel came down and bestowed them with knowledge. I learned otherwise. Story 20. When we went on trips, my sister and I always wanted to see deer out the window of the car. My parents told us the longer we were quiet in the car, the more likely we would see the deer because they didn't like loud noises. An amazing con. Story 21. I used to think there was this one dude who listened in on my conversations with my mom, so whenever she said, "Be back when the street lights turn off," he would turn the lights off early just to annoy me, laughing. Story 22. That little Lulu was made in Argentina because she looks very similar to the character Mafalda by the Argentinian cartoonist Quino. By the way, I am Brazilian. Story 23. I knew about sex, but I thought there was no way my parents were doing that, so I believed that when my mom got pregnant with each one of the three of us, she just swallowed a pill to get pregnant. Story 24. I cannot remember how old I was, but we were watching something on television about the effects of drinking, and I remember they had a liver from an alcoholic that they were showing, and I was just absolutely horrified. I had no idea they were talking about alcohol. I thought they were talking about drinking anything, water and Kool-Aid, you name it. I cannot remember how long I went before drinking anything, but I struggled for a while before I decided that I would just have to live with a nasty liver. Story 25. As a child, I was told that if I sat on something cold made of stone outside, my ovaries would freeze and disappear, and I would become infertile. I also believed that children were delivered painlessly from the belly button when it was time. Story 26. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, one of my friends went on vacation. Apparently, they traveled by airplane to their vacation destination. Mind you, this happened about 20 years ago. Once she came back to school, she told us everything about the vacation. Then she said while flying, she touched the clouds and said, "Hi" to them. Then, she brought some back home in a plastic bag. Once she reached home, she released it, and the cloud waved goodbye to her. I believed all of it. I didn't realize how silly the story was until I embarrassed myself after sharing the whole thing with my brother. Story 27. I thought that when a couple got married, they had to have a baby 9 months later. Now, of course, some couples do have shotgun weddings, and other wives get pregnant on the honeymoon, but I thought it was automatic. Story 28. My mom told me growing up that if I was awake, she couldn't sleep. It was probably her way of just saying, "Go to sleep. I don't want to keep staying up late checking in and out until you finally sleep." But as a kid, I believed that she physically could not sleep unless I was asleep, like our ability to sleep was intertwined. Story 29. When my Nana's dog passed away, I was only little, and when I asked where he was, she pointed up to the sky and said he's in heaven. The only problem was from where I was standing she was pointing directly at an airplane, and for the next 3 years, I believed that when people talked about heaven, they were talking about planes. Story 30. That if I played with my belly button, it would come untied and I would deflate. My older sister caught me playing with it once and told me that story, and I believed it for longer than I should have. So when she had a daughter, I told her the same story. Story 31. Okay, this is embarrassing, but I was a little kid when Elvis died, and about a year later, I asked my friend's mom, who was a nurse and pretty uptight, how Elvis died. She told me it was because he spent too much time on the toilet. After that, I became terrified to spend too long on the toilet, and this persisted until I was a bit older and discovered how he actually died. Story 32. As a kid, I remember hearing a nuclear bomb could happen by splitting the atom. So, for the next day, I was very careful whenever I cut something, in case I caused a nuclear explosion. Story 33. I thought the moon followed me wherever I went. I would look out of the car window during long drives at night and be absolutely convinced it was moving just to keep an eye on me. Story 34. That there was treasure inside of us. Like quite literally, if I slice you open, jewels and gold will come tumbling out. I'm guessing it came from a teacher somewhere along the way being like, every single one of you is a treasure, and youngling bombshell Betty took it to heart. I was embarrassingly old before I was finally like, okay girl, you've taken biology. You know these things can't both be true, but it's so hard to get those things out of your head once they're locked in. Story 35. My mom told me that if it's raining and the sun is out, that means the devil is beating his wife. I was like 4. My mom is great and not religious at all, so I don't know why she told me that. Story 36. My family had this thing where, if we were out somewhere and I was misbehaving or not doing what I was supposed to do, they would tell me we were about to get thrown out by whoever was in charge of the place. And kid me totally believed it every single time. We are in a restaurant and I will not eat my food. Better finish before the chef comes by or he will throw us out for hurting his feelings. We are on a ship and I will not go to sleep because I am excited. We will have to call the captain and let him know this 4-year-old is not sleeping. My younger cousin is throwing a tantrum at Disneyland. She better stop or Mickey will throw us all out because he hates yelling. It honestly worked like a charm. Story 37. It wasn't a belief, but how I question my beliefs and my mental stability. What is real and what is not? There is a sketch by Mitchell and Webb that touches on the absurdity of it all, where Webb, with great difficulty, asks very non-confidently if people can levitate. Of course, Mitchell challenges him for asking such a stupid question, but Webb explains he knows it sounds silly, yet something had happened that made him question everything, and he realized he had never honestly asked the question, and it scared him to do so, or something to that effect. I saw some parts of the film The Thing as someone way too young to have done so. Those special effects were so amazing and so real looking it blew my mind. I was seeing this alien creature with the actor's head. It looked exactly like him. Better than Arnold Schwarzenegger's stop-motion animation and special effect heads in The Terminator and Total Recall. This looked real, as did lots of the alien bits. But that actor is alive and well and wasn't pulled apart to make the film. Aliens don't exist and especially don't look like this. These are special effects, but they looked incredibly real. So what did they do to make them so real? If that's what fake can look like, what real things are fake and what fake things could actually be real? Does God actually exist? That's the mentality it led to. If that artificial creation can be made to seem so real on screen, what else is actually real or fake? This is the mindset I had and hence why I hated horror films, as the power of suggestion and special effects got under my skin. It made my mind melt. Satoshi Kon's films delve into sleep and dreams and imagination and the blurred lines of what is real and what is not. After seeing Perfect Blue for the first time many years ago as an adult, it messed with my head hard and gave me weird nightmares for weeks. Story 38. My dad was gifted this Folgers coffee can with a label on it that said, "Whoop ass." He had it sitting on a shelf in his office, and anytime my siblings and I acted up, he would go pick up the can and start to open it. We would begin hysterically crying and apologizing. I opened it a few years ago in my mid-20s, and it's just an empty coffee can. Still smells like coffee. Story 39. That people can have birthdays on 2 days. I remember telling people I was born on the 28th and 29th. It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but at the same time, I wish somebody had corrected me sooner rather than later back then. Story 40. I don't recall ever not believing in a higher power or God without being told. I don't think it's ridiculous, but it got very interesting. I would correct adults who told me their religious ideas of God because I would tell them how they were wrong. I was really vocal about there not being a bearded, judgmental sky dude and things like that. I was like 3 years old. I wasn't the type to correct people on stuff generally, but I'd apparently get pretty angry about this when people would try to tell me their nonsense. Thankfully, my parents weren't jerks to me about it. Though they insisted I'd be respectful to grown-ups about the God, higher power, etc. matter just like with everything else, they were very supportive and figured I must just know something. So thankfully, I didn't end up with religious trauma like a bunch of people, or not because of that. Story 41. I believed the internet would be a font of all knowledge that would elevate humanity to greater realms. Instead, I got lies, TikTok, and inane questions. Story 42. My siblings told me, the baby of the family, that if I swallowed a cherry pit or other seeds, a tree would begin to grow inside me and come out of my mouth eventually. It scared the heck out of me. After swallowing a cherry pit once, I spent the next year looking into the mirror each morning, opening my mouth and checking to see if a tree was growing. Oh my gosh. Story 43. That my mother loved me. Dark and depressing, but she is a true narcissist and only cares about herself. I haven't spoken to her in years, and she still hasn't ever met her only grandchild, my son, and never will.